Welcome everyone to our URI Cooperative Extension and College of the Environment and Life Sciences Learn at Home educational webinar series. We are in for a treat this evening with Dr. Rebecca Nelson Brown, who is my colleague and professor of plant sciences in the Department of Plant Sciences and Entomology at the University of Rhode Island. Dr. Brown's going to talk about autumn in the vegetable garden. Next slide.
Try that. There we go.
Great. So this webinar series briefly is brought to you by Cooperative Extension, which for those of you who are not familiar is the awesome part of the University of Rhode Island that is actually responsible for bringing science-based resources out to the public, in our case to Rhode Islanders. And there is a school like ours, a land-grant school in every state in the United States, and there are cooperative extension units in every state. And so if you're joining us from somewhere other than Rhode Island, we encourage you to seek out resources in your own community through cooperative extension. Next slide. So this talk falls within our food systems and agriculture focus area. And as we move into 2021, we have been working really hard in extension and really across the university to make sure that we are serving all of the people of Rhode Island, not just the people who come to us. And so we appreciate you sharing information about this series with your friends and family and acquaintances and coworkers. There's something for everyone. The topics vary from horticulture to energy, and it's really important to us that we get this information out in any way we can. That's Buddy making an appearance in the background. Next slide. So just a couple housekeeping items. First one is that when this webinar is over, there will be a follow-up email automatically sent to you with a link to a survey. We read all of the responses to those surveys, and we use your responses to make these programs better each time. So thank you so much for taking a moment to do that. Also, if you have friends, family, coworkers, acquaintances who are not able to join us this evening, this webinar and all of the ones we offer are put up on our URI Cooperative Extension YouTube channel, and they're also closed captioned for the hearing impaired. And so we'd encourage you to just do a quick search for URI Cooperative Extension once you're in YouTube. Pretty easy to find us. So I think that's all I have for now. I'll be back at the end, but I'd like to welcome Dr. Rebecca Brown. You all are in for a treat, and thank you, Dr. Brown, for being here.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome everyone. Happy official first day of autumn for 2020. And I invite you all to join me in the garden as we look at spending autumn in the garden. So this is a picture of my garden, the URI teaching garden, which is at the Gardiner Crops Research Center in Kingston. This picture was taken on August 31st. And as you can see, this looks very much like a summer garden. This is the same garden, just from the other side. And I took this picture yesterday. One of the big differences, besides almost a month of time, is that on Sunday night, we had a flash freeze where the low temperature went down to 28 degrees. And that really threw our garden headlong into its autumn mode. So many of you may have the idea that gardening is basically a summer activity. There's a lot of focus on planting gardens in May and June, a lot less focus on planting gardens for fall. But this is largely a product of marketing. All of the garden centers and big box stores get their marketing campaigns out in March and April and are really pushing everything for the garden in May and June. And by August, they're looking at back to school things. However, historically, before supermarkets and the global produce trade, people had to grow their own food for as much of the year as they possibly could. And our ancestors had many techniques to extend the harvest period for their vegetable gardens through the fall and all the way into the winter. And modern market farmers, the commercial growers who sell at our farmers markets, have rediscovered and improved on many of these techniques as they seek to bring us locally grown produce for as much of the year as they can. So we are going to look at 3 sets of techniques for extending the season in your vegetable garden. The first is planting for fall, and then we will look at ways to extend the summer to extend the harvest of those heat-loving summer crops. And finally, preparing for spring. So, start with extending the season. What is our climate like here in Rhode Island? One thing to remember is that 40 degrees Fahrenheit is the minimum daytime temperature for plant growth. And as long as it is warmer than that during the day, our gardens will continue to grow. The other thing to remember is that early frosts, like the one that we had Sunday night in Kingston, are the exception rather than the rule here in Rhode Island. In general, our research farm in Kingston has the earliest frost date in Rhode Island in the fall. And over the past 15 to 20 years, that date has ranged from October 3rd to November 3rd. So in many years, we have another 6 weeks at least of the growing season from the first day of fall. And in general, if it will warm up again after the first frost, particularly when the first frost is early. And we can thus continue to grow pretty much until the second week in November, when our day length drops below 10 hours and our temperatures really start to get below 40 degrees even during the day. That said, growing in the fall is not the same as growing in the summer. Plant growth rate, the amount a plant grows in a given 24-hour period, is determined by temperature and light. And as this chart shows, the amount that a plant grows in a day is much greater in the middle of summer when the days are long and the temperatures are warm, and it drops off fairly quickly as we get into the fall. This curve is the amount of growth per day. It's not the cumulative growth. But that rate doesn't really drop to zero until right around Thanksgiving. And as you plan ahead to the spring garden, it's worth remembering that that rate picks up above zero by the end of March. So what does this mean for growing in the fall? Basically, it means that growing in the fall is the opposite of growing in the spring. Our crops grow really, really quickly when we first put them in the ground, and then their growth slows down as we get further and further into the fall. This means 2 things. It means that the planting date is very important, because 1 week of difference in planting date can mean 2 to 4 weeks of difference at harvest. It also means that plants take longer to mature than in the summer. And so you want to add 2 to 3 weeks to the days to harvest that's listed on the seed packet. But the nice thing is that plants can remain harvestable for a very long time in the fall, because by the time they're mature, their growth rate is really, really slow. So, what are we going to plant for fall? We need to choose cool season crops that prefer temperatures below 65 degrees Fahrenheit and that can survive overnight lows below freezing, either on their own or with some protection. And as this list shows you that, well, things like tomatoes and basil and summer squash do not do well in the fall garden, there are a lot of things that will grow very well this time of year. In general, our fall crops are grown for their leaves or their roots rather than their fruits, and they generally need fewer than 1,200 growth units from seed to harvest. During the summer, this translates to about 65 to 75 days from planting to maturity. They can tolerate cold weather down to 26 degrees Fahrenheit and are generally actually planted in the summer and harvested in the fall or winter. It's actually getting too late in the year to plant your fall garden. Most of your fall garden crops should have been planted in August. So you will notice that there were no fruiting crops in that list, with the exception of peas. And the reason for this is that many of our fruiting crops are tropical, so they need warmer temperatures to grow well. And a lot of the others are day length sensitive. They develop their flowers and their harvested portions in response to lengthening days. And the natural response of these vegetables to decreasing growth rate in the fall is to grow leaves and roots, not flowers, tubers, or bulbs. So there are a few secrets to fall gardening. First of all, you want to seed weekly, starting in mid-July and continuing through August, for continued harvest all the way up to Christmas time. You can start with either transplants or seeds. Seeds germinate very quickly in warm soil if they're kept moist, but the weeds also germinate quickly in the summer. And so transplants can let your vegetables get a jump on the weeds. However, if you're growing for fall, you will probably need to start your own transplants. You want to use row covers and tunnels to create a warm, sheltered space for plants to grow faster, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. And you can use organic mulch, such as leaves, straw, or wood chips, to keep the soil warm longer and allow your crops to continue to grow longer. You also do need to remember that raised beds and containers get cold faster than in-ground gardens. So the best place to put your fall garden, if you can, is directly in the ground. Okay, so I mentioned that if you're going to use transplants for your fall garden, you are probably going to need to grow your own, because most of the garden centers aren't selling vegetable transplants in July. The advantage is that it's actually much easier to grow transplants for your fall garden, because you don't need a greenhouse, grow lights, heat mats, humidity domes, and all of the other things that we use in early spring to create a good growing environment for our plants. You do need shade, but you can start your transplants outdoors, under a tree, an awning, on your porch, under a shade cloth supported by stakes. And you do probably need a table or other support to keep your seedlings off the ground and out of the reach of all the critters that would like to eat them. You will also need easy access to water. You don't want to let your seedlings dry out, and this may mean that you need to water several times a day. And then just like in the spring, you'll need containers and soilless mix and your seeds. Okay, so we've talked about the things that you can grow in your fall garden and how to start your plants. So now we'll talk a bit more about row covers and extending the summer. So one thing to remember as we move into the fall is that the soil temperatures are generally more stable than air temperatures. As we saw Sunday night, air temperature can drop very, very quickly in a very short time, but the soil temperature takes days to change. And in the fall, the soil is generally warmer than the air. The soil has spent all night or all summer warming up, and it cools down very slowly as we get into fall. So when we cover our plants at night, we trap heat from the soil around the plants. If we cover our plants during the day, we trap solar energy, increasing the air temperature around the plants and also increasing the soil temperature, which will in turn help keep the plants warm overnight. And these increased temperatures increase plant growth. Covers also reduce water loss and reduce wind damage to leaves. And in fact, one of the important reasons to cover our fall garden as we start to get into late fall and early winter is to help protect the plants from cold winds and snow and ice. So what sort of covers can we use? There are a bunch of different types, some that you can buy, some that you can make. Clear plastic or glass is used to trap heat around the plants and warm the air during the day. This is particularly useful in October when the sun is still fairly strong, but the air may be quite cold. In contrast, fabric covers are most useful for trapping heat at night and protecting crops from the frost. These fabric covers do block light, so generally need to be removed during the day. Covers supported on hoops are good for protecting plants from damaging wind and rain, and mesh covers protect against insects. There are small covers such as these that you can just put over your plants. Some of them are pop-up covers that will fold flat for storage. Others are what we call cloches, which are rigid frames that go over your plants. And still others are floating row covers or row covers that are laid over small hoops. There are also larger structures for growing plants in the fall and winter, in particular cold frames and tunnels. These bigger structures have more thermal mass and they provide more protection against the cold. So they're particularly useful if you want to try to keep greens like spinach and lettuce and brassica greens going all winter long. Cold frames, such as this one here, or the old style one made out of a pair of old windows, are very wind resistant, and if placed against the foundation of a building can be quite warm, but they are generally not movable. There are some portable ones, but most of these are heavy structures that are designed to stay in place. Low tunnels, on the other hand, are portable structures that are designed to be constructed over top of the growing plants. The hoops are anchored in the soil, and then the cover is laid over the hoops and weighted down with rocks or sandbags, or in this picture, it looks like they were using bricks and pieces of wood. Low tunnels are much cheaper to build than cold frames, but are also much more easily damaged by the wind. The basic parts are the same no matter what sort of cover you're building. What you need is the cover material itself, a frame to support the material above your plants, and then some sort of anchors to hold the material in place. Size is the biggest variable in all of this, and size is determined by what you are covering. Are you trying to protect your tomatoes and eggplants from frost, or are you trying to cover spinach plants or baby lettuce? And whether you want to be able to access your crop without removing the cover. Do you want to be able to actually walk in under your cover? And then if you're going to leave your cover in place over the winter, you need to consider wind and snow load. So floating row covers, which are made of a white spun bonded polypropylene material, are very common on farms in the fall. These are also known as floating row covers and can be used with or without supports. So as you can see in this picture where they're growing baby lettuce, they've laid the covers directly over the lettuce. However, you can also lay these covers over hoops. They trap heat from the soil around the plants to provide nighttime frost protection and prevent radiative cooling. And the heavier the cover, the more frost protection it provides, but at the same time, the less light it allows through. So usually in the fall and winter, we're using Agribon 30, which is right here and is intermediate both in frost protection and in light transmission. Agribon 15 is very lightweight and is mostly used as an insect barrier during the summer. Low tunnels are designed to protect a single row of crops in the field. These are small tunnels, usually 30 inches wide and 12 to 18 inches tall, made with 9-gauge wire hoops and clear perforated or slitted plastic covers are used to accelerate the growth of young plants. These allow more light through than spunbond material and trap more heat, but they don't prevent radiative cooling, and so they're much less use for frost protection. These are usually used in the spring, but they could also be used in the fall, particularly in October. It's usually warm enough in September that we don't need these. There are larger low tunnels that are 5 to 6 feet wide, made with 8 to 10 foot PVC or steel pipe hoops that are intended to be used to extend growth in the fall and to overwinter cool season crops. These can be covered with 10-foot wide sheets of greenhouse plastic, with spunbond covers, or with both. And in fact, when they're used for overwintering, they often have a layer of spunbond covered with a layer of greenhouse plastic. These are designed to remain in place for several months, and heavy snow will push these tunnels flat, but when the snow melts, they'll pop back up again. Even larger midi tunnels or caterpillar tunnels are made with 20-foot long pieces of pipe. These are tall enough to walk into to harvest or weed, but they're not designed to withstand snow load. So you generally need to take the covers off before snow is forecast. In these, the covers are attached with ropes tied to ground stakes, and the ropes run over the top of the tunnel. These tunnels are too large to simply weight the covers down with bricks or sandbags. When you're designing your covers, you want to keep your covers as close to the plants and the ground as you can. So you want your cover frame to be just a little bit taller than your plants. Wire hoops are the least expensive frame material, but they only work with lightweight covers, and they can only cover short distances, usually only 30 inches. PVC pipes work with low tunnels and can span a distance of as much as 6 feet. And larger tunnels are going to require steel pipe, particularly if you want to leave the tunnel cover on over the winter. Covers for low tunnels, if you have a lot of wind, should be anchored with both pins and weights. So row cover pins or sod staples, and then put rocks or bricks or sandbags on top of the pins. You can, of course, use polycarbonate or glass and actually make a greenhouse, or use old windows to make a cold frame, but these require true frames, usually wood, plastic wood, or metal. You're not going to be able to use these heavier materials with PVC and wire. Okay, so with these various sorts of covers, it's possible to keep your fall garden going well into November and possibly as late as Christmas. But eventually, even the fall garden has to end. And at that point, we need to start preparing for our spring garden. So one important thing to remember about your fall garden as you think ahead to spring is that you need to keep weeding. Your summer annual weeds, like this pigweed plant here, are going to seed now, and they can produce a lot of seed. This pigweed plant has more than 100,000 mature seeds on it. And if you allow those seeds to drop in your garden, then next summer, you could very easily have 10,000 pigweed plants. So better to get those weeds and their seeds out of your garden now. You also want to remove fallen fruits from the garden. Remove those rotting melons and those split tomatoes, because volunteer seedlings can spread disease next year. You want to clear your garden of residue, because many of the insect pests and fungal diseases that affect our vegetable gardens overwinter in stems and leaves and rotting fruits. And as you're clearing your garden of weeds and diseased plants, remember that home compost piles do not get hot enough to kill weed seeds and disease spores. So if you use the compost from your compost pile on your vegetable garden, then you don't want to be putting these things into your compost pile. The other thing to remember is that fall and spring are the seasons of maximum risk in the garden for soil erosion and nutrient leaching. So you want to make sure that you protect your garden soil by mulching with leaves or by planting a cover crop. You don't want to leave your soil bare over the winter. Mulching or planting a cover crop also has the advantages of reducing growth of winter annual weeds and adding carbon to the soil. Fall is also the best time to add many of your soil amendments, including lime, rock phosphate, or green sand if you need phosphorus or potassium. And you should get a soil test in the fall to tell you whether you need to add these things. Fall is also a good time to add brown manure to the vegetable garden because it has the entire winter to decompose and destroy any possible pathogens in the manure. But even if you spread manure on your garden, you should still mulch or cover crop to trap the nutrients from the manure. And this is true even if the manure's been composted. You still want to make sure that you're trapping the nutrients that might be released over the winter. You also want to start planting for spring. Remember to plant your garlic. Garlic should be planted when you plant daffodils as late as November. I usually plant my garlic on Halloween. And if you haven't ordered your garlic yet, you should make a point of doing that. I've heard that supplies are going to be very tight this year because so many people have taken up gardening. September is also a great time to seed living mulch in paths between your garden beds because many of the clovers and grasses that we use as living mulch will establish very readily this time of year, and there's less competition from crabgrass and other summer annual weeds. You can go ahead and prepare the beds for your early spring crops, get them all dug and shaped and ready to plant, and then cover them with leaves or with plastic tarping to prevent erosion. The advantage of this is that in the spring, you don't have to do any digging. You just have to remove the cover and plant your early spring lettuce and peas and other crops. You can also grow salad greens all winter in your cold frame or under lights indoors. So this is another picture of our teaching garden. This one showing that even though the tops of the summer peppers and eggplants were burned by the frost, down underneath we still have healthy leaves and sweet, juicy peppers. And that's what I have for you this evening. So I believe we can open it to questions.
Great. So we do have a few good questions, and I have some too. So Dawn is asking about transplanting her strawberry plants. Should she do that in the fall now or in the spring?
Probably best to do it in the fall. A lot of commercial growers actually do it in July. So it's getting to be a little bit late, but still better than spring.
And Valerie's asking how she can treat her garden to prevent black spot on her tomatoes from occurring again next year.
Well, it depends on what the black spot is. That's really hard to diagnose from that description. But in general, clearing out all of the old tomato plants is a good start because many of our tomato diseases do overwinter in the debris.
And speaking of vegetable garden debris, so I have a leaf mold area, and I've been trying to keep the garden debris, old vegetable fruits and stems and leaves and such separate, but I did end up putting them in there. And so my question is it safe to use that compost outside of the vegetable garden, knowing that it's not going to heat up and kill any fungi or other problems? So like on perennial beds or
It should be okay. I mean, to a certain extent, if your compost pile is like mine, it grows volunteer vegetables anyway. So to a certain extent, you're going to be spreading diseases, and a lot of these diseases are spread by the wind as well. So they can spread from your neighbor, they can spread from the next town over, they can spread from New Jersey. So we're not going to avoid them. And you will have more weeds than if you got a weed-free compost, but at the same time, you're not paying for the compost. And as we've seen, even when you pay for the compost from someplace like Casella up in Johnston, it may not actually be weed-free.
Right. Yeah. I just would hate to waste it, but I also don't want to. I don't want to cause other problems. So we've got a lot of great questions here. If going back to the strawberries, and there was another question about rosemary, if they're in pots right now, is it best to sink them in the ground to overwinter, insulate them, or bring them inside, put them in the cellar?
Yeah, so they definitely don't want to leave them outdoors above ground in pots. They will freeze. Depending on where they are in Rhode Island, down at the research farm, which is zone 6A, rosemary is hardy in the high tunnels and would probably be hardy in a cold frame, but it is not reliably hardy outdoors, even sunk in the ground. So I would bring rosemary in. However, if they're on the coast or on Aquidneck Island, that's zone 7, and sinking the pot in the ground should be sufficient. We're really right on the edge of where rosemary can reliably overwinter.
Okay, how about strawberries?
Strawberries will overwinter, no problem. Yeah, they're completely hardy here.
Rosemary.
Yes.
All right. So another Dawn said, if I have a small raised bed garden, how can I rotate next year's crops to avoid insect and disease? I assume buildup. Will it make a difference in 2 small 4x8 raised beds to move things around?
It won't make a difference. Your best bet for avoiding insect and disease is cleaning up well. And yeah, with that small a space, rotating doesn't really make a difference.
That's good to know. So that's like, 60 square feet total.
Yeah.
That's good. I didn't realize that. Holly asks, can you recommend any drought-resistant veggies?
Yeah, that's tricky. Veggies generally are not drought resistant. They generally expect to be watered. I realize that that's been hard this summer, but your best approaches for dealing with droughts like what we had this summer in the future are to really work on building up the organic matter in your soil so that it holds what water we do have. And then even if you have an outdoor watering ban, remember that you can use gray water to water your vegetable garden. So for instance, if you're washing dishes by hand, use the dishwater to water the vegetables. When you take a shower, put a bucket in the shower with you and use that water to water your vegetables. Vegetables are a high priority, much higher priority than ornamentals.
Or lawns. Yes.
Yes. Well, I consider lawns to be ornamentals.
Oh, right. Yeah. Monica is asking if she wanted to start raspberry bushes, should she plant them now or wait till spring?
Probably wait till spring, because raspberries are usually sold bare root to be planted in the spring.
All right. Sandra,
however, she could start the bed now. She could go ahead and start preparing the bed. Now is a really good time to clear the bed, work in soil amendments, get a soil test, get everything ready for spring.
Great. And folks, you can actually, we have a box outside the Malin Center on the URI campus, and the master gardeners are collecting samples, put in that box and testing them inside and getting them back to people. They've been itching to do soil testing, so it's a beautiful thing in a pandemic. So if you want to take a ride down to Kingston, we have a box outside our office. I'll put the address in the chat. Sandra had the same question I had. You mentioned living mulches to plant in between rows. Personally, my pine chips aren't cutting it. It gets very messy. So I'm wondering what and Sandra too, we're wondering what your favorite living mulches are.
Okay, so, well, first of all, I will say that I really like living mulches between like raised beds. So like if you have permanent raised beds, I'm less sure about living mulches between rows. You know, if you're just doing a flat garden where you dig the whole thing up every year. For that, it's often better to just put your rows closer together. But as far as living mulches, a mixture of grass and clover does very well as a living mulch. And you can use, any of the cool season lawn grasses that grow here. So fescue, ryegrass is good for a short lifespan mulch, but probably not if you want something that'll last years. Kentucky bluegrass is good. You can actually buy bluegrass, fescue, and microclover sod and use that to make your living mulches. If you want to have something that will go in very quickly and last a long time.
For cold frames, Kristen's asking, smaller ones made of wood and hinged windows, do you have recommendations regarding ventilating?
Yeah, you definitely want to be able to ventilate them, particularly in the spring. I don't have a lot of experience with them. The one that I used to have had sliding windows, so you could just open the windows part way. I will say that if you're using glass windows, make sure that you have a way to lock them open when they're open all the way. Because otherwise they will blow closed. And when they blow closed, the glass breaks.
Yeah, it gets glass spinach.
Yes. Yes, I learned that one the hard way.
Oh, no.
I did not have a latch system.
We're making them here, and we were gonna use pump hinges to keep them up for that very reason. It's a little nerve-wracking. So Joseph had a brutal June bug infestation this June. Any ideas about eradicating? As a note, he was going to redo his raised beds, extending the walls to 2 feet and replacing the soil with Mel's mixture for early spring. He already started purchasing the vermiculite due to shortages earlier this year. June bugs.
I really don't know that much about June bugs because they're not actually crop pests.
Thought you were going to say that. So, Joseph, you are welcome, and everyone really, you're all welcome to send questions in to gardiner@uri.edu. I'll put that in the chat also. We have a gardening and environmental hotline that is staffed by trained URI master gardeners, and they're very diligent about getting great science-based answers. So that may be a good question for them, and if they can't answer it, they will shop it out to an entomologist. But good nerdy question there, Joseph. I hope you can get some help on that. Dawn asked a great question about composting. Is a Rubbermaid bin, I assume you're talking 75-gallon or on the bigger side. Is that big enough, do we think, to achieve high enough temps to get the compost process going?
No, not if you're trying to actually sterilize things. Even your typical, 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot home compost pile is not big enough. As an example, I used to take my students to Earth Care Farm to meet with Mike Murner. And he pointed out to us that his home compost pile was not hot enough to kill weeds and diseases. And this is a man who makes compost for a living. And his commercial compost piles were hot enough. And the difference, of course, was size. The commercial compost piles were small mountains. The home compost pile was a typical home compost pile. You just don't have enough material to get enough heat.
Yeah, that's important. And we have a webinar coming up about composting, folks, so you should check out the schedule and join us for that. We have tons of great questions. Jeannie Marks, who's an old friend from the Audubon Society, is asking, will hay bales around a raised bed protect it from the cold, I assume, for a community garden in Providence?
They'll definitely help. One thing to remember, though, is that those hay bales are also perfect habitat for mice and voles.
Yes.
So you'll need to keep that in mind, particularly when you start planting in the spring and you've now put a salad bar next to the rodent compound.
That could be fun, but not when you go to harvest. Deb's asking, do you soak your garlic in a fish or kelp fertilizer before you plant it around Halloween?
I actually don't. I do soak my garlic or treat my garlic with actinovate, which is a biological fungicide, to help protect against corm rotting diseases. But I work all my fertilizers into the soil rather than soaking the bulbs.
Okay. Slow method. Olivia wants to know if she can overwinter her artichokes in the ground. These are great questions.
That is a great question. As with rosemary, we are right on the edge of where artichokes are hardy. So it depends on where you live in Rhode Island, how well you mulch them, and what kind of winter we have. I have never tried. I grow artichokes in the teaching garden, but we treat the teaching garden as an annual garden and get in there with the tractor every year. So I've never tried to overwinter the artichokes.
How long into the fall does the cabbage butterfly stick around?
Well, there are 4 different cabbage butterfly species, and some of them are native, and they tend to stick around until we have a really hard freeze. So you need to keep checking your cabbages.
I'm still checking my kaleettes, and
Yep.
there's still party central going on. So I see them flying around. I'm not sure which one they are, but yeah, the pests are.
I can't tell them apart either. Some of the entomologists can, but
Yeah. I just know they cause problems. Shoba's asking when to plant cover crop seed.
as soon as you get the crop out of the garden. So we've been planting cover crop seed at the research farm for 3 weeks already. And we would have even more planted than we do if we'd had rain. We haven't bothered planting it because there's no water. But usually in the vegetable garden, the thing that limits when you can plant is when you get your vegetables out. If you haven't planted by the end of the first week of November, you're probably better off mulching with leaves.
That gives me so much purpose in late October, early November. This is great. We still have about 7 minutes till 8, and there's so many great questions. So I'm going to go to the Q&A. And so Anna was asking, she said, I've been covering some of my plants. I noticed a temperature difference reported between weather services. For example, this morning around 6 a.m., NOAA, National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, said it was 38 degrees Fahrenheit, but the Weather Channel said it was 44 degrees Fahrenheit. What do you use for weather service data?
Well, so I generally use the NOAA forecasts, but I also have the advantage that we actually have a National Weather Service weather station on the research farm. And so when it comes down to it, those are the numbers I use. And if you're going to make a serious effort at fall and winter gardening, it's probably worthwhile to get yourself a max min thermometer and put it in your garden, because part of the reason you get such a big difference between forecasts is that it matters where the forecast is for. And even then, the 28 degrees that we had at the farm overnight was not in the forecast, even the Weather Service forecast for Kingston.
Interesting. We have about 7 questions about cover crops. Folks are looking for specific best cover crops to use, and then do you till them in the spring? Can you talk a little bit about that process, including why we do that?
Yeah, so cover crops serve a variety of purposes. They help to soak up the nitrogen that's left in the soil now so that it can't be washed out by the rains. They suppress weeds and they add organic matter to the soil. They can also help the soil to dry out in the spring. For home gardeners, your best cover crops are probably going to be annual ryegrass, cereal rye, oats, peas, and possibly vetch. The annual ryegrass and the oats are going to be the easiest to turn in with just a walk behind rototiller. But the others are doable, particularly if you mow them in the spring. You don't want to let them get 6 feet high like the farmers do, because you don't have a great big tractor, unless of course you do, but that's a different conversation. And if you're growing on that scale, you're welcome to contact me or Andy. But yeah, annual ryegrass is a very good option for a homeowner cover crop.
And that goes in as soon as the plants come out?
Yep, and it can go in up until that first week of November. Legumes, peas and vetch, we're really starting to run out of time to plant those. They need to go in the next week or so.
Okay. Great. Folks, we're not going to get to all these questions, but this has been a really great conversation. There's a question about, a lot of questions about when to plant. So I would address folks asking about when to plant certain things to the Rhode Island planting calendar, which is something that we have Dr. Brown and Andy Radin, our ag agent, review periodically to make sure that as the climate is changing, we're addressing that reality. But it basically tells you on a 2-week kind of cadence when things like to be put into the ground. And so it's a quiet time right now on that chart, and we're going into garlic season, garlic planting season, but I'd highly recommend you check out that resource. I will put it in the chat. Many of you may have seen I put the address for the drop-off soil testing in the chat. And so we're going to say Rhode Island planting calendar. So check that out if you have questions about when to plant specific veggies. And then also if you want to know more about cover crops or some of these broader, some of the broader questions folks are asking, you can check out the e-extension search. You can find that online. I find that it's not necessarily easy to find information specific to Southern New England, but it will generate science-based resources from cooperative extension land grant institutions, which is important. You want to make sure you're getting good information. And as I said before, you're always welcome to send questions to our gardening and environmental hotline. We have people sitting by the computer waiting for questions to come in via email, and we encourage folks to send photographs when you send questions in. It's easier for them to help you when you do that. Dr. Brown, if you wouldn't mind going to the end, do you have those couple slides at the end?
Yes, I do.
Go over those. So if you want to learn more about this thing called horticulture and gardening, there's a great opportunity in the URI Master Gardener program. That is a popular program across the United States. We happen to have a very strong one here in Rhode Island, and we're very grateful to have faculty like Dr. Brown teaching. That course is from the end of January to April. It's a semester long. The applications for it are up on the website now, and they're due November 1st. You can find all of this information on the web. So we encourage you, if you have a love for gardening or want to learn more from scientists, join our family, and then we will send you out when things go back to normal to share your knowledge with other members of the community, which is actually the point of the program. And lastly, this last slide, we have a number of resources available. Folks are asking about that Rhode Island planting calendar. You can find that, and our weed identification chart, which I found incredibly helpful in IDing the weeds that come up in my garden and also my lawn. So if you click that top link there, jot it down quickly, or you can just Google URI gardening resources. That'll come right up. I've mentioned the hotline a number of times. It is a real thing with real people, so use it. And we have a webinar like this every Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. They are hosted either by myself or my colleague Vanessa, my colleague Sajal. We have a full schedule coming up through December 15th. Every Tuesday, lots of great topics. And generally, if you have any questions about what we do in extension, you're welcome to send us an email or give a call. With that, it is 8:01, so I will be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you, Dr. Brown, very much. This was fantastic. And thanks to all of you who asked questions. If any of your questions are pressing, do send them into the hotline.
Yep.
Stay warm, everyone. Thank you.
Happy gardening, everyone.
Okay.